So here's what we have in store for you guys today. Today, we'll be diving into getting started with the Zoom Apps JavaScript SDK. We'll provide you with the overview of what the Zoom App SDK is, how to publish it to the Zoom App Marketplace. Then Max will take over. He'll do a deeper dive into the code. And then finally, we're going to walk you through the prerequisites and guide you on a hands-on session on how to build a simple Next.js app that actually uses OAuth Pixie. And then finally, at the end, we'll wrap it up for Q&A. So any questions you have, feel free to put them in the chat now, but we'll also save some time, some space at the end for you to ask those questions as well. So first and foremost, what is a Zoom app? A Zoom app provides developers with the ability to build a Zoom app within the Zoom client. So you can port any application, any web application you have into the Zoom client for users to use, both within the meeting, outside the meeting, and in the Zoom team chat environment. How does this work? The Zoom app runs with web views in an embedded browser in the Zoom client. So the idea is once your Zoom app is published in the marketplace, users can add it to their account and use it within the Zoom client. This enables and creates engaging experience for customers both before, during, and after Zoom meetings. Here is an example of what a Zoom app is. You may have heard of Kahoot. They have a published Zoom app. And as you can see, by clicking the button, able to join a meeting, and the Zoom app opens immediately. So you can find Zoom apps in the Zoom app marketplace. We have some popular examples you may have heard of, like Phantom Note Taker, Prezi, Warmly, and Read.ai. So really showcasing a variety of different use cases that you're able to build in the Zoom client. Now we get to the good and fun stuff. Here's an overview of what we'll be building today. We're going to build a simple Next.js app that's secured with Pixie OAuth. By the end of this workshop, you will know how to implement the OAuth installation process, methods for implementing the Zoom app JavaScript SDK, and we'll also share best practices for how reloading and troubleshooting. So again, in this session, you will learn how to implement OAuth endpoint. You'll learn about the Zoom app JavaScript SDK and this APIs that's available to you, and about securing sessions. At this point, I'm gonna hand it over to Max, who will walk us through the code snippets and dive deeper into the hands-on part of this workshop. Take it, Max.
Thank you so much, Dante. So yeah, like you mentioned, we have a few key components here, and I really just want to share a little bit of code to familiarize you with what we'll be looking at through the day. So here's an example of how we would implement a secure session and what exactly I mean by that. So when we're going through that OAuth Pixie flow, that's OAuth proof key for code exchange. So we need to exchange a code verifier that we store server side. And in order to do that, we're going to store it in a session, which we then can encrypt in a cookie. And so that's really the starting point for what we're going to build today is we'll start with the Next.js app. I'm going to send over some files that will implement sessions, and then we'll look at how we can use those sessions to begin installing our app using OAuth with Pixie. Next slide, please. So talking about OAuth with Pixie, you might be familiar with creating an API integration with Zoom. And if you are, then you know that we require a redirect URL for that OAuth flow. And so part of what we're going to implement today is that function that serves as our endpoint for that OAuth flow. So you can see here, if you're familiar with the Pixie process, we're getting a code and a state that we use. We're setting that state. And then we're making use of our session to get a verifier. And we'll dive into this code specifically, including those get token functions and get deep link functions, which are able to make use of the Zoom REST API using the same token that we're using for our Zoom app. So that'll be the second part of what we implement. Next slide, please. And then finally, of course, we'll want to show you how you can use the Zoom Apps JavaScript SDK. Next.js has some interesting requirements in terms of running asynchronous code client-side. So we'll talk about the best practices and some of the challenges there. But here's an example of how you would do that within UseEffect, which if you're a React developer is kind of an interesting pattern. Awesome. So here's a breakdown of the different steps that we'll be taking throughout the workshop. We have a GitHub repository that I'll direct everyone to, and we'll move on to the step 00 branch to start. That's going to be the scaffold of this Next.js project. Basically, just something I created with the create next app generator. And then I added on a couple niceties to make it easier to develop Zoom apps with. And so we'll go over everything that I've added to that. And we'll work to implement sessions. And those sessions will allow us to store data for the OAuth Pixie flow. And so we'll create our initial install endpoint there. We'll move on, we'll create the OAuth redirect. We just talked about the code there. And once we do that, as we mentioned, we'll implement that Zoom Apps SDK. And from this point, we will have a working app inside the Zoom client. But we'll go over some of the issues we might have as a developer, having an easy to work with developer environment, and just various improvements that we can make before moving on to the final step, which is setting you guys off to explore this app yourself, as well as our documentation to see how you can extend it and make it your own. So let's talk a little bit about what you're going to need today. I assume that you have a developer environment that can work with JavaScript kind of just as a base, and a terminal to work with, maybe Git to clone this repository. We'll provide you with an exact list later. But let's go over some of the unique things that we'll need today, starting, of course, with Zoom. We'll want to make sure that we have a Zoom account where we can create an application on the Zoom marketplace. And so that would mean that your user has roles that include developer privileges, and that will allow you to follow along and make that app. Next, we're going to want a free ngrok account. A paid one works as well, of course, but you don't need to use a paid one for this, and I'll stick to the free features for this demo. But this is going to allow us to take our local host server and create an external HTTPS tunnel because the Zoom Marketplace requires that we use an HTTPS URL. And as you see, it also requires that we enforce strict transport security on the site as a header. So we'll get into that further. But to finish this up, we will need Node.js. We use npm to pull in all these dependencies, and Next.js really works best with like a node tool like that. Let's move on, and we'll just double check the next list of everything to make sure that everything here is what you have. So you want to have a JavaScript IDE, whatever you like to write JavaScript in really works. I'll be using WebStorm. Visual Studio Code will work great. You also want a Bash terminal really to follow along. If you're on Windows, you should be able to access the Windows subsystem for Linux to get a Bash terminal, and otherwise you should have a Bash-like terminal on Mac OS or Linux or something like that. So I should have that built in. Also make sure you have Git, ngrok, and npm installed. So I'm just going to pause here for a moment. I've said a lot of information, dumped a lot of requirements. So if there's anyone in chat who needs help installing some of this stuff, or if they aren't sure what some of this is, then happy to help out there before we get started.
Likewise, anything anyone needs, we're more than happy to help. We're also available on the forum, and we'll make these resources available to you. So you can always access them as well.
Let's see. Yep, I'll just make sure. I'll wait a moment to make sure that this makes sense. Everyone's ready to get started. Then we
And
can
that'll be
begin. All
So let me
right.
just add this one thing, Max. Really encourage you guys if you have any feedback or anything any ideas you may be having to throw it in the chat. That way we can respond and help you build out the use case that you want.
Right, exactly. Um, yeah, if you run into any issues building this out, whether it's this getting started with your environment or any of the steps that we go through here, uh, feel free to put it in chat. This should really be more collaborative just to make sure that we're all on the same page before moving forward. So for anyone that's following with, let me know when you're ready to go. And otherwise, we'll move on and begin sharing our uh, our workshop. So I will share my screen here. And one of the first things I want to do is put this URL in the chat. This is the GitHub repo that we're going to be working with called Getting Started with Zoom Apps. So if everyone wants to clone this repository, clone it with HTTPS is the way to go. Then you can either open this in your IDE or bring it up in a terminal. I'm going to use a terminal just because that's a little bit more universal. And we're just going to clone this. Great. So I'll open this up in my IDE after I change into that folder. All right, so here we have this, and we can either continue using this terminal to interact with our app, or if you have a terminal in your IDE that you like to use, you can go ahead and do that. I'm going to switch to the terminal in my IDE from now on. From here, I'm just going to run npm install right off the bat. And of course, this will install our npm modules. But what it'll also do, yes, this was a clone to TimeEd. So I cloned this into take a look at this right here. Did a git clone on that URL from that repository I shared. And then I changed into that folder.
Mhm. So, just like as a refresher, uh, this is a simple Next.js app, JavaScript that is a web application, and we're going to be building this app that is both available in the Zoom client um, during meetings, after meetings, and we're going to show you what that whole process looks like.
Yep, exactly. So I'm going to open up my terminal here again, and then I just went into that folder and I ran npm install.
Max, when you get a chance, can you zoom in a little bit? So,
It should we should be seeing a zoomed in screen now. Do you see that?
uh, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Um, so let's see. We've run this npm install here, and what this has done is it's taken this .env.example file right here, and it has generated a .env.local file. And in doing so, we've randomly generated a session secret that we can use for our secure sessions. We can see that we need a client ID, a client secret, and a redirect URL. So that's going to be our next step, is to go obtain those things by creating an app in the Zoom Marketplace. I know that when I create an app, I'm going to need an ngrok URL. And when you're on a free account, you get a new ngrok URL every time you restart it. So I'm going to start ngrok right now, and I'm going to copy that URL. So either in this tab, or I think best in a new tab, in a new terminal tab, we're going to go ahead and use ngrok. So that looks like this. You use the ngrok command. You tell it that we want an HTTP tunnel. Today we're going to use port 3000. If you hit enter for that, you can see that we're given an ngrok URL right here. So we'll go ahead and copy that. Let me know if this is making sense, if everyone's following along. Should have npm install run. Okay, TimeEd, where are you at in the steps? Let me
So
navigate.
what Max just did, he just opened up another terminal, and ngrok is a tool that allows you to tunnel HTTPS from your local environment, so you can render your site securely. So that requires open up another terminal and running that last command he just ran. If you can show us that.
Yeah, so I'll start all the way from the beginning too. Yeah, exactly. Let's start from the clone. So I copied this URL from GitHub right here. So I clicked the code button, and it has this clone drop down right here. I copied this URL, and I took that into a terminal. I use this terminal, but this one might be a bit harder to read, so I'll go over to my IDE. And I use the command git with the argument clone, and I pasted that URL in here. And what that did was downloaded this Zoom Apps Workshop 00 file. Okay, and so after that git clone, I moved into that folder so that I could start working on it, and I ran npm install. And so that just installed some dependencies. So for those of you following along, let's make sure that we have the folder downloaded and that we have run npm install before we move forward. This is really getting these credentials set up. Will just require a little bit of configuration in Zoom, and we'll come back into this app, paste some things in, and we'll be all set. So once we've cloned that and we've installed, like I mentioned, we'll have this .env.local file right here, and we'll get this ngrok URL. So I'm going to take this URL, and I'm going to give that to Zoom once we configure everything. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Great, so I've just logged into Zoom Marketplace here. This is where we can create an app. This is where your app would end up being published. And so once we log in and with an account that has developer privileges, we'll see that we have this develop dropdown as well as a manage dropdown. So for those following along, that's another step that I want to make sure we can accomplish. Let's make sure we can log in and we have the ability to click build app. So I'm going to go ahead and move through, and I'm going to click build app, and we're going to build a general app today. Awesome. So let's make sure that this app is user managed. And here we can see we have app credentials. So this is a client ID and client secret that we need. But it's requesting that we provide it with a redirect URL. So I had you copy your URL from ngrok so we can paste that in here. And because I know what I want the auth endpoint to be, I can fill it in now, and we're just going to put /auth at the end of that. So that's where Zoom is going to redirect to when it completes the OAuth flow. And now, when I say OAuth flow, it might not be exactly apparent what exactly I mean by that. So let's take a quick look at our documentation so we can have a better idea of what this redirect URL is and why we need it and where these credentials are going to come into play.
So Max, can we, oh, okay. So yeah, little attention to the redirect URL, which I think is important. So thank you for the question you had. I didn't want to know, where did you get the redirect URL from?
Yeah, so let's go over that. So after I did my npm install, I opened up a new terminal tab and I used ngrok to create a tunnel to port 3000 on my local system. And so when I run this command, it will generate a new URL each time. So I want to leave it running, but I can copy this URL here and paste it in as my OAuth redirect URL. Now, because I know the app that we're going to build out today, I know that we're going to want it to be on the /auth rep. We're going to build out our app so that this connects with it. But for now, you can just enter this in here, and uh, and that's how you can get your redirect URL. But I do want to talk a little bit about the OAuth Pixie flow and how I know that I need to do this, right? How if you haven't built an app, it might not be apparent that you need to go through this process or what OAuth Pixie is, or even that we use it. So if you navigate over, you don't have to necessarily follow along with this, but I just want you to be aware that at developers.zoom.us is where all of our documentation lives. And so with a couple of clicks, I can get through to the information that I need so that I can build this out. So in this case, I want a documentation for our user managed OAuth. So user OAuth right here. And it gives us some information about OAuth 2.0, enables you to securely integrate with Zoom APIs and webhooks. What it doesn't mention there is also Zoom apps. And so if we click over to this page right here, it gives us a little bit more detail about what we need to do to get an access token. An access token will allow us to call our APIs and to authorize for everything to show that we are who we say we are. So we really want an access token to make use of our APIs and SDKs. So let's look at these two steps right here. First, we want to request user authorization. This is the flow you're used to when you install an app. It tells you the permissions that it's going to use, and you accept those. You say allow or install. Um, and then once that authorization is approved, it's going to redirect to the OAuth redirect URL that we set. It's going to give us some information that allows us to request that access token. So request user authorization and request an access token. When we request user authorization, we are really just redirecting the user to a Zoom US/OAuth/authorize URL where we fill in some parameters for it that tell it exactly how we want to authorize. So you'll notice there are some similar things here, like a client ID and a redirect URL, like we have in the .env file. So this is where these are going to come into play. We'll generate our own state value, which is optional. And this can allow you to prevent cross-site request forgery, as it says down here on the bottom. So we'll go through that optional extra security step. But what's not optional is this code challenge and code challenge method. And this is really what OAuth Pixie is. You could do this OAuth authorization without these, and it would just be regular OAuth. But these code challenge and code challenge method allow us to create an extra layer of code exchange that we can use to prevent third-party attacks and people intercepting intercepting this request. So we'll build out this. This essentially we'll just build out a URL and we'll redirect our user to it. It'll look something like this. And then that will, after they allow our app and install it, that will send it back to our redirect URL that we just set. So let's scroll down here to this request access token. So once we get to this point, we'll be using our client ID and client secret in order to request an access token from this endpoint. And so for the most part, we'll just need to retrieve the code that's sent to us and also fetch the code verifier that we've stored in our session. And those are two pieces. This is actually the device code version, so we won't need a device code. Let's see if yeah, this just includes device codes. So we won't need to include a device code. We'll just really need to provide it with a code verifier and a code as well as our redirect URI if we're using a device. So how do we use it? So let's take a look at this. So this is our API. We've got our user's endpoint right here. If we send it an access token with it, that enables us to view information about ourselves, which your access token should, then we can print out an object like this, and we can use this for the code that we're writing. We won't necessarily be making too many API calls. We'll really just make an API call to get a deep link and redirect the user back to the client. But this OAuth process is very important. And even if you move on to kind of more complex OAuth flows like a client, an in-client OAuth flow, you'll still want to have this browser-based flow that we're going to implement. So this, everything we're building today is going to be the foundation for really any Zoom app that you want to build. And just stopping for questions and comments and making sure I am caught up with chat. And so I just want to make sure that everyone's in the same spot before we move forward. So I've pasted my specific ngrok URL here. You should paste your ngrok URL here and put /auth at the end. And this will automatically add it to our OAuth allow list.
And just for additional context, what ngrok is doing, taking the website that is running on localhost 3000, and it is porting through that random generated HTTPS endpoint that we got from ngrok when we executed that command. And this allows us to run the website securely. So Max, it would be great if you can go to localhost 3000 and then show them when you get started that the ngrok URL takes them to the same exact landing page.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good call. I'm just going to walk through a couple more steps here for configuration after I make sure that all the questions are answered. So I'm seeing what happened to IPFS. I'm not sure if I know what you're referring to there. Is that an acronym? But yeah, this will be recorded as well. If anyone wants to go back and watch these steps, we'll also publish a blog about how to use this application and kind of the details that went into creating it. So the next configuration step here is to go down to the Surface tab on the left-hand side. And so we're just going to click this meetings option right here so that we can enable our app to work within Zoom meetings. And what this does is tell, because you can build really any type of application with this flow, this tells Zoom that we are looking to make a Zoom app specifically, or a web application that's going to run within our Zoom meeting. So we'll want to give it a home URL, and we'll want to allow that URL just for security purposes. So it's easy enough. We can just paste in our ngrok URL here. Make sure you don't have a space at the end. And we'll see that right now it says it's missing required OWASP headers, which is very important. And we will discuss that in just a moment. But let's make sure that we have pasted in our ngrok URL here. And then we've also added it as in our domain allow list. I'm just going to give an explanation of a test domain. And so in the domain allow list, you don't want to have the HTTPS protocol. You just want the domain name there. And that's how you configure this to work within Zoom meetings and to be displayed in the Zoom client. We can also add some in-client app features. We have a lot of stuff down here. These are a few different modes that you can enable along with the SDK for a Zoom app or a team chat app. So I'm going to enable the Zoom Apps SDK. And we're not going to directly call any JavaScript or any APIs except for the configure API, which we don't have to enable through here. But I just want to show you that you can search for, let's say, share app, which we'll use as an example here. And you can add that as an API. And you'll need to do that before you use it within the Zoom client. Okay, and so with this, we can see that we now have a Zoom app in meeting scope that's been added to our application. And we have a client ID and a client secret that we can use with our app, as well as a redirect URL. So let's copy these into our .env.local file and go ahead and try to start our app. So that's that client ID, pasting it in there. Now I'm copying my client secret. Typically, you wouldn't want to show this to anyone, let's say in a webinar with a lot of people. But because I trust you guys and because I know this app is scoped to just be a basic Zoom app, I'm going to go ahead and paste my client secret there. Let's see, and then we just want to copy this redirect URL that we pasted as well into our .env.local file and save it. You can see this file is ignored by Git, which is intentional so that we can't accidentally push up any of these credentials to our repository. So let's take a look at some of the other files that are in this project before we run it, and some other things that I've set up outside of a regular Next.js app. So as you can tell, we generate a session secret here. So I have a file called gen session. We don't have to go over that. This isn't a necessity. I think it just makes it easier following along with a sample app to not have to do this extra step in the terminal. And so I usually end up adding this to my apps. But I think what's more important with this basic app that I've changed is I've added some headers right here. And these headers are required by all Zoom apps in order for them to be displayed in the Zoom client. And so if you don't have these headers, what you'll be presented with, even if your app works outside in a browser and you know it's bulletproof, it will just display a white screen and a console error if you don't have all of these headers in here. And so alongside that, if your content security policy isn't configured correctly, you'll also get a console error because this is enforced. And so with strict transport security, we'll want to make sure that we have HTTPS everything, essentially. We'll want to make sure that everything is secured with HTTPS. And then our refer policy, our X content type options, and these depend on your use case. Really, you can just use same origin in most cases. And if you disable content sniffing, then I think these are sane security options. This content security policy is left pretty open for sample purposes, and because when you start using these reactive libraries, often you have to use, especially in development mode, an unsafe inline or an unsafe eval. So for production, your headers would look a bit different, and you would probably actually set them at the server level where you're hosting your application. But it's important to note that these were added in the nextconfig.mjs file, and these are helping the application to run in the Zoom client. And so because we're not running our server yet, when we navigate over here to our Surface tab, it's pinging our ngrok URL, and our ngrok URL is having trouble. So you could also set these headers through ngrok, but it's, we just need to start our server, and then we can go ahead and have those headers available to us. So let me just clear this up so we can see it a little bit better. And I am going to start up our server. Great, so I used npm, the node package manager, with the run command, and then told to run the dev script. And this is just the default developer server that's provided by Next.js. So we're just starting up that default development server. It's hosting here on localhost 3000. So we can click that to see it. And we can see that it's pulling from our .env.local file. This I actually think is cached. Actually, you know what? Here's what we need to do. If everyone could go to your repo, if you're following along. And I forgot to tell you let's check out step 00. We won't lose anything we've done with our .env.local, but let's start from the beginning because the main branch is actually the completed app. So we'll run git checkout step 00. And what this is going to do is change the files that we've pulled down. You can see that even in this version, I still have these headers set. And now when I navigate, let me open up localhost. Now when I start our server again, should just be presented with a black screen. And so this is where we're going to start, a little sneak peek in terms of where we're going. But make sure you're on that step 00 branch to get started if you're following along. That step 00 branch will just have a blank screen here and not a lot going on. And so we can see that if we navigate to localhost 3000, we can see our app, but the problem is that it's not secured by HTTPS. So let's navigate to the ngrok URL, where now we can see our app from our local computer is being tunneled through this HTTPS secure tunnel. And this is how Zoom is going to be able to access it. Okay. So our next step is really going to start off with some coding. I'm going to send some files so that people can add them into a folder that we create, and we'll move forward from there. So I just want to make sure that this is all making sense to everyone. Everyone's following along with this, and if we need to backtrack, then we can definitely go ahead and do that. Coding we do should be fairly straightforward. I'll send files that have kind of a lot of the more involved session code, and we'll just kind of talk about the more involved code. And then from there we can we'll implement our own files, which will be relatively straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and send some files in to chat right now. And we're going to make a folder Can you explain why you're using ngrok over the localhost 3000? Yeah, that's a good question. So uh, localhost 3000, we can see our app, but the problem is that it's only local to our system. So if you were on a device somewhere else, if you tried to go to localhost 3000, you would go to your own localhost, you go to your own localhost page, right? And so if you're serving something there, you'd see your own app, or if you're not, you wouldn't see anything. So what we need a URL that's accessible by Zoom, so that it knows where to redirect to. In in a production instance, you might notice at the top here it says development. We're using development credentials. In a production instance, we would set a different redirect URL that went to our real domain, right? But because we're developing this, we just want to give it a domain that links to our local development environment. And we also want that to be secured with HTTPS, right? So HTTPS means that it's secured by a certificate and that man in the middle can't sniff any information from that app. So we need HTTPS and we need this to be accessible really anywhere in the world, right? Because we need Zoom to be able to open this app. We need Zoom to be able to redirect to this link. We need everyone to be able to click our Zoom app and open it up in the Zoom client. So we can use localhost for development, but it's not going to work for our OAuth flow, and it won't work for when we actually go to display it in the client. So really the app that we're building is something that would work as in your browser as well as um, within the Zoom client. So for that reason, um, that's why we really want to make sure that we're like creating an app that works in all environments. Awesome. I'm glad that helped. Um, so here we are. Let me just paste 3 files into chat right now. Should see 3 files now. There's session.js, zoom-api.js, and dal.js. And what we're going to do is go into our app folder and we're going to create a new directory and we're going to call it lib. So make a new folder in your app directory called lib. And I just want you to put those files I gave you into that lib folder. Go ahead and place those files in there, make that directory. We just need to copy them over. And I'll talk a little bit about what's in these files. So I think the most pertinent one to what we're doing right now is our session file. See if I can expand this. There we go. And so what this does, this is fairly standard code. I linked to the Next.js documentation at the top for stateless sessions. We're pulling in our session secret from the environment that we set, and we're encoding it. And from there, we have a couple of functions that we created. One is called encrypt, and one is called decrypt. And so those are going to allow us to encrypt our session payload before we set it inside of a secure cookie. Then I'm pulling a library called Jose to sign our JWT, and this is how we're going to encrypt the cookie. So we're using an HMAC 256 algorithm and setting an expiration of 7 days, just as an example, and then signing our payload with this encoded key. And so let me just do the reverse, excuse me, for decrypting. So where we use these is within the create session. We'll use the encrypt function within this create session function that we have right here. This is also fairly standard code taken from their documentation on stateless sessions and just modified a little bit so that it works with what we're doing. But this is really the code that we need to create those sessions in the session.js file. Another part of best practices, at least working with Next.js, is to have a data access layer. This not only caches the request to get this data, but it abstracts the object that accesses the data from the object that creates it. And so it can prevent global variable overlaps and just accessing things that you didn't want to be accessed from the initial object anyways. So I um, I checked that we have a valid session based on that code verifier. And if a code verifier wasn't set, then I've never created a session with this and it's invalid. But, excuse me, I'll grab some water here. Okay, so I only allow it to return the state and verifier here. And so it just makes sure that I'm explicitly returning what I want to return. And so these two files really enable us to use a session within Next.js, and would exist really with any Next.js project that you want to make a session. I just have some stuff that's specific to our project right here. And I'll pause because that was a lot of code, that was a lot of information um, in terms of setting up a session. So if there's any questions on how I had figured out how to do this or what's going on here, let me know. For the most part, for these two files, I was going through the Next.js documentation to see how we could do this.
And the state and code verifier, Max, what does that map to in our documentation? Is that a part of OAuth?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So yeah, this verifier is the code verifier, like you mentioned, and this is the state that we went over earlier um, that we have when we want to request user authorization. So let me just go up all the way up here. So we have a state that we set here, and later on in the process, we're going to need a verifier. And so those are, because we need these after the app redirects to our URL, we need somewhere to store these in the meantime. And so that's why we're making this session, is so that we can store our code verifier and our state for later. But because these are so critical to the auth process, we can't just store these in plain text. We can't just store these on the client side. We have to, if we do store them on the client side, they must be encrypted, right? And so we are taking a server-side session and we're encrypting it as a cookie that we store client side. And so that way, in this case, we're just using everything server side, but by transforming it into a cookie that is client side, when they load up our app, we can decrypt that cookie and start their session back up based on the information that we find in there. So this session object would be powerful throughout your entire app that you create, not just this OAuth Pixie flow. But it's very much been tailored to just work with OAuth Pixie, at least for this app. So that's sessions. Let's look at the Zoom API.js file, which has quite a bit of stuff in it. So for some reason, getting errors here, but oh, there we go. Okay, so here we have a bunch of different functions that we can use to interact with the Zoom OAuth flow and APIs. And so I've created functions here that kind of are generic in some cases and can be reused for multiple purposes. So the code might not be super clear unless you really look over it and look how these things interact. But I'll try my best to kind of show how you can create these generic functions that allow us to work with OAuth. If you don't understand it right off the bat, that's fine, because we're really just doing that request authorization step and then request access token step. So here we have some nicety functions that I made, some syntactic sugar, I think is what people would call it. Uh, this is just takes a string and converts it to a base64 URL. We'll need that as part of our process. This will return a random number based on a format and a bit depth that we give it. We'll also be using that to generate our state and as well as our code challenge for OAuth. And so next we have a token request function. This is a function I use to request either an access token or a refresh token from the Zoom API based on what I send it. And so this will make more sense once you see the functions that use it. So similarly, I have a generic function that can call anything on our Zoom API. You just say, if I want to get /users, you just do that, and it'll return it to you, return the object to you. So this will be used further down as well. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of our request user authorization step. So like I mentioned, when we first go to request user authorization, we're basically building out a URL that we want to redirect the user to, right? It looks something like this. And so that's what we're going to do. Keeping in mind that we want to generate a state and we want to follow the code challenge method steps of Pixie. So to start off, we're going to use our random function up there, and we want a format of base64. It defaults to a depth of 32, so we're just getting a random base64 value for our state. And then we're getting a random ASCII or text value for our verifier. Then we're going to use a cryptographic function to hash this as a SHA-256 encrypted string. And what we're doing here is we're taking our verifier and we're creating a code challenge from it. And so what this does is it sends this challenge to the server, and then we have to send the verifier that goes along with this challenge later on in the step. And that just confirms that the server that initiated this user authorization request is the same server that's going to be receiving the access token. And that's similar to the state value that we set, but the state value is more for us. It's for us to make sure that the person that is sending us the code is the same person that we sent the request to. So these are two ways that we further secure the OAuth process. So again, I'm taking that random verifier and I'm using it as basically what's the initialization vector for this this cryptographic function right here. We're converting it into a base64 value that is acceptable to be used with URLs, which is why we had to make that special function up there, so that we remove any values that wouldn't be valid in a URL. And now we've got our code challenge. And this is what we want to send to Zoom. So we're going to start building out our URL here. I've set my Zoom host up above, and I've just you can set it in the environment file if you'd like, if you have like a Zoom government account or something. But I'm just using this value that I hard coded in, and later on API host will just use this value. So that's how we're going to begin building the URL that we need to redirect our user to. So our response type is code. And we'll see that this will match up with what our docs have here. So our response type is access response type being requested, supported authorization workflow requires the value code. So we will enter code there for that, and then we'll provide it with our client ID that we set in our environment file and the redirect URL that we have in our environment file. You might notice that we've already given this to Zoom, but this is actually so that it can match up with what we have set in the marketplace. Finally, we give it our code challenge and we let it know that we encoded it with SHA-256, and we set our state parameter. So for our purposes, I just return all three of these from this function. I return the URL that we want to redirect the user to, the state that we want to store in our session, and the verifier we generated that we also want to store in our session. So this right here is the code, essentially, to kick off step one, request user authorization. So we have some functions down here. Get token, we'll use this in the future, but this just requests an access token. So we'll look at that in a later step. And so then we have some functions for, and this is a function for the refresh token. So access tokens will expire and eventually we'll need to refresh them. We don't have logic for that in our project just yet, but we do have the function to refresh a token should we need to. Then just a couple of functions to call the Zoom API. Here I'm calling a GET request on the /users/UID API, and this will return the user that I provide it with. And then we have get deep link, which we'll actually be using today, where we can get a deep link that will open up our Zoom app from the web browser. So tons of code here. Maybe you're seeing why I had you paste these files in instead of going through and writing these out. But these are all really what enable us to have some of our best practices with this application. Some of these helper functions for the Zoom API, as well as our session. So our next step is we're actually going to use all this code. We're going to create some code. And so I just want to make sure that everyone that's following along with us live it has these files pasted into your lib folder. And then we'll go ahead and move forward. And if there's any further explanation that we need on, I think specifically this get install URL function and how that pertains to our OAuth flow, let me know. I think another important thing to mention here is I'm not just making a string and building my URL as a string. I'm using this URL object. And if I end up building an invalid URL, it'll throw an error. So this really ensures that I'm building a valid URL every time. Okay, great. So in our app folder, I'm going to create a couple new directories. I'm going to create first an auth directory. And in Next.js, when you use an app router like this, and you create a file with a route.js a folder with a route.js file in it, or page.js, that creates the path in your app. So if I were to put a route.js file in here, I would have /auth. So you might be seeing how we can use that to create the /auth redirect URL that we set earlier. But I'm actually going to create another directory inside of that first called install. So we should have auth and install. But based on what I just told you, that means that this would be /auth/install when we open up our app. But only if I put a file in there to tell it that it's a route. So I'm going to create a JavaScript file called route.js. And in this JavaScript file, I'm going to use all of the functions, well, not all of the functions. I'm going to use some of the functions that we just went over. So I'm going to import get install URL from this Zoom API file. And I also want to import create session from the session file that we created. And this might start to make sense because I'm going to get the state and verifier from this get install URL function, and I'm going to create a session with that information. So in order to create a method, right now what we're doing is we're creating an API endpoint for our app. And we can do that by doing export default function, and we're going to call this function get. And what that means is anytime a get request is done on /auth/install, then this code is going to run. And so first off, I just want to run get install URL. So we know that get install URL returns a URL, but it also returns a state and a verifier. So we're going to use this destructuring operator to get all three of these from that return value. And we'll want this function to be, we're actually not going to export as a default function. We're going to export it as an asynchronous function. That's my mistake there. And we want it to be asynchronous so that we can use await within here. And we're going to await with create session because this is an asynchronous function. So with create session, I can pass it a payload that we saw in that function we went over, and I want to send it the state and the verifier. So we're getting that state and verifier, we're storing it in a session. Now we need to kick off the install process. So we're going to do that by redirecting the user to the URL that we have. And we do that by having return response.redirect, and we will give it the URL. Awesome. Now we have this new route that we've created. Let's go see what this looks like in our browser. We still have our development server running here. We still have ngrok running. Let's open up our ngrok URL. And we have a blank page here still, where we just created our /auth/install route. Right, so let's go to that. Let's see what happens. And you can see that immediately we are brought to this, we're redirected to the authorization URL, which brings us to this user consent flow to install our app. I'll go ahead and click allow on this. And you can see that it redirected us right here to our /auth redirect URL that we told it to redirect us to. And it provided us with a code, but also provided us with the state value that we set earlier. So we can see that we're building the correct authorization request here, and it's redirecting back to our app. But unfortunately, if we look at our app, we haven't built this functionality yet. So our next step will be to build that out. Just going to get ready for the next step here. So if you want to follow along, but you haven't, written some of this code, or you haven't been able to paste in some of these files, what you can do is follow along with the steps in the repository. And while you won't be able to run it unless you add in your credentials, you can at least look at the code that we're kind of going through here and follow along that way. So I'm going to remove my changes here, and I'm going to check out the second step, which is actually step one. Starts with, sorry, I actually have to delete this file. This is confusing, but the step here that I'm about to check out is what we just did. So this will allow this, if you're following along or you just want to see the code, you can check out step one, and that will take you from the beginning where we were all the way up to now, where we've placed those files into our lib folder, and we've created this install route. So I just have to remove the changes that I made here. And you can see that when I check out step one, that now I have these files again. So step one starts off with what we just did. For those of you who are interested in following along that way. So from here, what we want to do is create the /auth route, right? So if we currently, this /auth redirect doesn't do anything. And we need to make the code to respond to this and really do the second part of our OAuth Pixie flow, which is request that access token. So I'm going to create a new route.js file in the auth folder. And in this route.js file is where we're going to begin to create another API endpoint. And this API endpoint will be that /auth endpoint. So it'll be a little bit more involved here. We're doing a lot more with this function, but this is really the heart of what the app's doing. So we're assuming that when someone has been redirected to this point, that they have already created a session because they've gone to the install route where we generated that session. So we just want to use verify session from the data access layer that we have. So we can use all that caching and abstraction that we created by making that data access layer. Another session related function that we're going to need is delete session, because once we're done with this session, we'll just completely remove it. And then we are going to use a get deep link and get token function from the Zoom API. So we kind of briefly went over those. We'll talk about them a little bit more once we actually start using them. And then we're going to actually need one more function that we don't have yet. And I'm going to have us create our first file in the lib folder that we can use here. So let's go over to the lib folder and make a new JavaScript file. It's going to be a short file. We're just going to call routing.js. This is going to give a little helper for us so that we can handle errors in a way that makes sense for us. So we are going to make use of some existing Next.js tools called Next Response. And this, if you're familiar with Next.js, this will probably make sense. But I'm just going to make a function called handle error. And it's going to take an HTTP status and an error message. And we're just going to return a, autofill not working the best. We're just going to return a JSON body with that. And we just want to return an error message along with our HTTP status. Let's see, let me make sure that I didn't miss anything here. Yep, this looks good. And just to make it more clear, like we're passing in a value called status right here, so we don't have to put in that naming thing right there. So we've got this routing.js file, and we have our handle error function right here. So let's go ahead and use that in our route.js file. So we'll import handle error there. And then we'll get started writing our endpoint here. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the install route, where we're going to export an async function called get, but we're actually going to make use of the request object that it provides us with as part of that. And so we know that when we receive this GET request, we are looking for a code value and a state value. So let's make sure that we just grab those right off the bat. Um, we'll be going for the most readable, most explainable code at first, and then once we get into later iterations of this, we can look at optimizing things for performance and refactoring and things like that. So I'm getting the search params object from the request URL, and then I'm going to pull the code value from that. I'm also going to pull the state value from that. So now we have at least the ability to respond to this endpoint and pull these two values. And if we do can log our code and our state there, and we can go back and see if this is working for us. We actually do need to start the development server. So if you moved in branches and you stopped that development server, make sure you start it back up. Otherwise, your app won't work. Fun tip. Okay, so now we're going to move through this user authorization flow. It says this page is currently unable to handle this request, and so we need to make it respond with something that makes sense. So we'll do response.json, and we'll just give it the code and the state here. Go through our install flow again. And this is something you'll do a lot as you're developing the stuff out. It looks like it's not working for us. Okay, we'll charge ahead and we'll keep making the rest of this so that we can build out a real route here. But what we do have now, ideally, is the code and the state values. So we're going to get our session and we're going to store those first. So here we're going to use that verify session function. And we want to make sure that there's a session here. I think that's kind of, oh, it looks like we got an error down here. No responses to terms from route handler. So this is the error that we're encountering right now, is that we need to keep building out this this route so that it's a valid route. So we want to make sure that we have a session. So if we don't, then that's when we want to throw an error, because that means a user is accessing this without having gone through the install flow that we want them to go through. So we just need to return an error. We use the handle error function that we have, and we're just going to say invalid session. And we're going to do the same thing for our code and our state. Let's just paste those in. And for our state parameter, you can see not only are we checking that we have a state, but we're checking that the state is the same as what is stored in the session. So that's where our session comes into play so far. But the next step where our session comes into play is where we obtain the verifier from it. So here's our verifier. We're just pulling that out from our session object. And now that we have our code, our state, and our verifier, we are ready for the next step, which is to request our access token from Zoom. So here's what this function looks like. We're calling get token with our code and our verifier. And so if we look back at the Zoom API file here, we can see that we have the get token function right here, which makes a token request. We've got a code. We send our code verifier, as well as our redirect URI and our grant type. And this all matches up with the second step in our OAuth documentation, which was to request that access token. And so by using this token request to make a generic function, all I have to do is pass the body that's unique to making this token request. Similarly, when I need to refresh a token, I just need to send the bits that are specific to refreshing a token. So that's why this is set up like that, and maybe a little more complicated than it needs to be, just so that we can reuse that code and we don't repeat ourselves. So calling this get token function, and as part of that, it returns my access token as a parameter. And so that's what this is right here. And so now we have an access token, and we're able to actually do something with it. We can call the Zoom API. So I'm going to call the get deep link function. And this is going to give us a URL that will redirect us back to the Zoom client and open our app, which is currently a black screen, but nonetheless, it will open our app in Zoom. So now that we have this deep link URL, I'm just going to delete our session, which doesn't need that. I'm just going to delete the session. And then we're just going to redirect the user to this deep link URL that we've just gotten. So there's that. And now we have a complete route handler, which we kind of went over in the sorry, the slideshow earlier. Great. So at the bottom, it looks like everything is compiling correctly now. So let's go ahead and check with our app and see if we can get an install to work. You can see it was redirected to open my Zoom client, but I believe I have a couple Zoom clients here right now. I believe it opened. Let's see if I can open the correct one here. I might need to change my settings so you can see this Zoom client. Are you able to see it right now?
No, we're not able to see it right now.
It says show my Zoom windows to other participants when I'm screen sharing, but I don't know if that works between clients. So let's see. Because I have enabled it to show Zoom windows to other participants. See if I can open anything as a pop out.
No worries. While we wait on that, does anyone have any questions? Is anyone stuck anywhere that we can be able to help you out with?
Are you able to see this pop out window?
No. We're still seeing the launch
Is it,
Zoom.
hmm. Let me see if I can share a window specifically.
You
Because
might be able to when you share, click on the Zoom client itself, and that should show it.
right, okay. Okay, so I have here, I'll share this Zoom client specifically. I'm not sure how this is.
There we go.
I'll maybe expand it so it's a little bit bigger. So what happens when that app install completed is it redirects and opens this client if you're not using two clients at once. Um, and so uh, now we can see general app 797 that we've created is here in our client. And let me just let's see if I can click this now. It's in a pop-out window, so pop in window. There we go. So now you should see our blank screen is running in our Zoom client when we click this. If you've enabled developer tools, which you would need to set a value in the terminal and then restart something, then you'd be able to inspect this element. The problem is that you need to restart your client or you need to navigate away from the apps toolbar and then come back. So it's kind of an involved process for those of you that are already in a meeting. But since I have this inspect element developer tool here, which we link to the documentation uh, in the resources, now I can look at my console and I can see anything about my app. I can look at my network resources and see that it's loading correctly. So great. I'm going to go back to sharing my main screen. Okay, awesome. So just to recap there, what we just did was make the /auth handler so that when Zoom redirects to our app, we're able to handle that code and state, match it up with our verifier, and we can use that code and verifier to get the token from Zoom. Then we call our Zoom API with that access token, and we fetch a deep link. And then using that deep link, it will open up the Zoom client. Once you have gotten past the user authorization step, the app is already available in the client. This is so that we can complete the Pixie flow and that we can deep link the user to our app. But if we didn't need the token, then we wouldn't necessarily have to go through the process of getting a token. And if we didn't want to deep link the user, we wouldn't have to go through the process of deep linking that user. Yeah, so that wraps up this step where we enabled that OAuth endpoint. This is the second key component that we went over in the slideshow. And we'll get started on the third key component. So I'm just moving along these branches. Moving up to step 2 now. And again, this is where we ended. So just making sure I'm ready to move to the next step. And this step is really just all about the visuals of our app. Well, not all about the visuals. We're also going to implement the third key component, which is our Zoom Apps SDK. Just going to grab some water here before we move on. Okay, so if we look at in our app folder, we have a page.js file. And this is currently our app. This is why it doesn't do anything and it only displays a black page. We just have some CSS to make the page black and show some errors if there are, but we're not really doing anything with the page just yet. So I'm going to import the headers tool from Next.js, and I'm also going to import. Actually, that's all we're going to do for now. We're just going to import the headers. And I want to check if my app is running in Zoom. So I can do that in a couple of different ways. If we look at the headers that are sent when you open your application in Zoom, it sends an app context header, which you can decrypt and pull information from. But it also shows a header called X Zoom app device type. And so I'm really just going to look for that header when I'm server side to see uh, if my app's running in Zoom or not. So I'm going to check. I'm going to get this header object right here. We can see we're getting an error because we need this function to be asynchronous. And I'm going to create a variable that says this is Zoom if the headers list has an X Zoom app device type header. And then if it is Zoom, I want to do something. More importantly, if it is Zoom, then I want to be able to run certain client-side code, namely the Zoom Apps SDK. So now that we can check if we're in Zoom, let's do something. Let's do something so that we can actually access Zoom once we are. So in this app folder, I'm just going to create uh, a brand new file, and I'm going to call this zoom.js. And I'll paste the code for the zoom.js file because it's a bit involved, so we don't have to go through typing it as we kind of approach our time here. Um, I'll paste this in here, and the important thing to note is that this starts with use client. So Next.js is so powerful because you can mix server-side rendering with client-side rendering, and you can establish you can frame your app in a way that's really powerful that you can't do with a lot of other things. But there, with that comes some downsides. Um, and one of those is how you use asynchronous code with what they call client components. And so there are a variety of different ways that we can do that. But the best way that I have found so far, and that they recommend in their documentation, is to call your asynchronous code within this use effect function. Um, so if you're familiar with React, this is a pretty standard flow, except for calling maybe the Zoom SDK within it, but using use effects and setting a state. So basically what we're doing is we're calling an asynchronous function that uses our Zoom SDK. And once that is complete, then we can check if we're in Zoom using a different method or not. So starting from the top, we'll import our Zoom SDK from @Zoom apps SDK, and then we'll import some React tools. We're using these React tools to set up a state and to call the use effect function. And the callback for that is going to call zoomsdk.config. And so what's happening here is we need to call this function every time before we start using Zoom SDK tools, like if we want to get user context or get the running context or use camera mode or anything like that. We need to configure the SDK and let it know what our app has been assigned in the marketplace and what it intends to use. So that's what we're doing here. We're just setting a state variable called config with the result of that as part of this asynchronous function. So this definitely isn't pretty. Probably some of the least clean code in the project, but it's what we need to do to get through that configure step. You can see that I have another type of check here, though. And because this is running on the client side, this is actually, this check is done at a different time than the other one. And I added this in here just to kind of show you a comparison between these two checks and what that is going to look like. So here, instead of looking for a header, what we're doing is we're checking to see, okay, does that Zoom SDK .config function complete? And if it does complete, then that means we're in Zoom. And if it doesn't, then that means that we're running in a browser. And there are definitely some downsides to this design that we'll see in a moment. For instance, this causes the Zoom SDK to always be loaded into the browser because you need to check if it can run in that browser. And so that's not necessarily ideal, but in future workshops, we can look at how we can improve this. So if this is in Zoom, we're just going to say we are running in Zoom. Otherwise, we're going to say we're running in browser. Awesome. I'm going to go through and paste some more code just to kind of move us along through this process. And I think a lot of this code here is something that I would want to paste anyways, just because it involves some HTML and a lot of classes and things like that. So we're going to create a function called render install button. And just a moment, sorry. It's hard to copy things sometimes. We're going to make a function called render install button, which I've placed right here. And inside this function is just, so far is just a link. We just return a link to our auth install flow. So I just want someone to be able to click this, to have an install button. Right now it's just a link. And if we want to use, say for instance, um, if we wanted to use this as a button with Tailwind and the CSS that we have, we would add a bunch of classes to it. So ideally, this is something that you would put in a class file, but I'm just going to paste the classes right here so that we can see them. So lots of classes there, making a pretty cool white button. Otherwise, if we're not in Zoom, we're not making it. Or sorry, if we are in Zoom, we're just going to return a blank span because we don't need to give them we need to give them the install button. They've already installed it. Okay, and so we've built a function to return and render our install button. I'm going to paste in our HTML for our home page right here, and just go through it super quickly. We're just showing a Zoom Apps logo, and then we show our server-side check that we did by checking the header. So we say if we're running in Zoom or in the browser. And then we do our client-side check that we did with our Zoom object that we created. But it looks like we just need to import that Zoom component. So let's do that. So we import Zoom from @/app/Zoom. Now we have that component, and we go ahead and enter it in here. Finally, in the footer of our app, we're going to call that render install button function, and that will put the install button right there at the bottom. Great, so let's try to load up our app. I think we might actually have something to look at now. And again, make sure that you're running your development server. It's a very key part for the app to work. Is it has to be on. Okay, so here we have our page that we created. We have our server-side check that tells us it's running in the browser, and we have our client-side check that also tells us it's running in the browser. And now we have our Install Now button down here. If you look down to our left, however, there is an error now. So let's take a look at what that error is. So the error that we're getting is the Zoom Apps SDK is not supported by this browser. And so we discussed that as an issue with the way that we implemented the Zoom Apps SDK, right? Is that we are pulling it onto the page to check if we can use it. And if we can't, then we know that we're not on the page. So that approach is maybe not ideal. And we have this giant install button down here at the bottom. Let's click it and just see if it works for our purposes. Awesome. And so let's take a quick look at what this is going to look like when you are within the Zoom client. Okay, so you should be seeing the client. We'll go ahead and reload this now. And you can see, I don't know if, for those of you that looked at this client-side check, if we reload this page, we can see that it thinks it's in the browser for a moment until it's able to complete that config request. It really has to wait for the page to load, all of the document to come in, and then for use effect to run. So we could definitely make some improvements there. If we look at the server-side check, so it says running in Zoom, it's good if we refresh the page. But I'm going to go into I'm going to go into my app and I'm going to change a value because we should have hot reload built in as part of this. And if I change a value in my app, it'll cause the app in Zoom to reload. So I'm going to just backspace a class and then hit save. And look at that. Now, because it did hot reload, it thinks we're running in the browser until we refresh the page, in which case it's fixed again. But essentially, hot reload is broken for us now. So let's, as a next step, take a quick look into how we can fix that. Okay, I'm going to hopefully remember to spin up the development server this time, but I'm just going to switch on over to step 3. I know we're running up on time here, but this last step is fairly quick. We just do a little bit of refactoring so that we'll fix some of the issues that we've introduced, namely the issues with hot reload. And we're not going to fix the client-side issues today. We'll look at how we can restructure this maybe in the future. We'll probably just make our server-side check so bulletproof that we can rely on that, and we can remove our client-side check. So the reason that when we reload the page, it thinks it's in the browser is because it's being loaded by the development server, and it has no context for whether or not it's in a Zoom app. It doesn't send the correct request headers that the Zoom app client would send when it loads the page. So we can fix this in a couple of different ways. We can dive into the Webpack dev server configuration for this, and we can change it there. But I think an easier way is to create a middleware function for this application. And that will intercept requests only when we're in development mode, and check if the user agent loading it matches Zoom apps. And if it does, then we'll go ahead and create that X Zoom app device type header. We'll mock this so that it thinks we're in Zoom. Well, we are in Zoom, but so that it knows we're in Zoom. Uh, and that will fix the issues that we're having currently with our server-side check and hot reload. So in the top level, outside of the app folder, is where I'm going to create a new file called middleware.js. And in middleware.js, you can first I'm going to need next response and user agent. As you mentioned, we're going to be checking that user agent. We're going to export a function called middleware, and it just takes in the request that's being made as much as my IDE wants to autofill otherwise. And we only want this code to run when we're in development mode or test mode. So we're going to say if this is not production. If we're not in production, let's go ahead and run this code. And so let's get these request headers. Yep, and so that's how we're fetching these. We're creating a new headers object that is fetched from the request headers that we've been sent here in our middleware. And we want to get our user agent string.
Hey Matt, are you showing another client? What we're seeing is your IDE.
Okay, here you go.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Thanks for that. Thanks for that heads up. Um, so looking at this middleware function, uh, we just want to we're getting our user agent here, and we've just seen in the client that was just shown that we're kind of building out this user agent check right here. So let's just paste in the rest of this code here and talk about it a little bit. Okay. So we're grabbing the user agent here. And if the user agent ends with this Zoom apps /1.0, we know that it's being loaded by Zoom, right? And so if it is, we're going to take these request headers that we grabbed and we're going to make our own. So we're making that Zoom app device type header and we are injecting it into the request headers that are being sent. And so in doing so, we can mimic what Zoom would do when it loaded the app in those cases where there's a hot reload. So let's start up the development server here. Let me see if there's any other, we'll look at just this change. There are a couple other changes that we could make, but let's start with this one because it will involve going back and forth between the client and sharing that. Great, so we're saving that. Let's move over to our app and I will go ahead and share the Zoom client again. Great. So here we have our Zoom client, we reload it. Our client-side check is still delayed. You can see that. Our server-side check is still running as we would expect. What I'm going to do now is the same thing. I'm going to go into my text editor. I'm going to go onto the page and just change a class that would force this to hot reload. And the problem is that I changed the class, but you can't tell, or maybe that's not the problem. In other words, we've fixed the issue where hot reload breaks if we can tell if we're in Zoom or not. And so because we have that ability, see, let me make sure I'm sharing. You'll be able to see this IDE here now. Perfect, yep. Okay, so now that we've added this middleware in here, and we can rely on our server-side check so heavily, we can ultimately just remove our client-side check altogether. We'll remove that HTML, and then we will go ahead and remove this code. And so now we've cleaned this up a little bit. We just have a server-side check showing. We're able to use the Zoom SDK. We're able to authorize our app. We've refactored it a little bit. We're aware of where we can improve it going forward, but ultimately this is a great base to just start building from. So, we can do something. We can log out the Zoom app config here, and with that config, we could, get our running context, and we could use that to determine if we're in a meeting. We could add further capabilities to our app, here, and then that would allow us to use any one of these functions that are listed now that we've integrated this into our app. So that was a lot, but that's about it for session one, getting started. We've stepped through setting up secure sessions, implementing that OAuth endpoint, and using the Zoom Apps SDK. So that's a ton of stuff. Kudos to everyone who's hung in there, whether you're listening along or following along. This recording will be available so that you can go back and kind of look at different parts and go at your own pace. And we're also here to help answer any questions that you have about any of this. Yeah, so here's where I'd like to direct you guys towards next. You can check out these sample apps as you've seen on our Zoom GitHub. And that's where this one is found. The main branch is the completed app, but you can start on step 0. and you can work your way up. So kind of like what I did by checking out each branch as I moved along. And so that's one way to go through this. Then make sure to check out our award-winning documentation, as my colleague O just likes to say. We
Mhm.
looked at some of our documentation today for OAuth Pixie, and we just have a ton more for this whole process. And I'm happy to point anyone to those docs that I maybe didn't mention today. And finally, if you need help, please join our community on the developer forum where we all like to chat about all things Zoom.
All
So
right. Now we want to open it up for Q&A. Any questions you may have, we're more than happy to answer. Feel free to ask any questions and so welcome. But we'd love to discuss more about, different use cases or anything that you may want to bring up in this moment in terms of like the possible use cases that you can build out and what tools are available to you to do so.
And so there was a lot there. I think, one of the pieces that's missing is maybe that I glaze over the developer journey through our docs. So, um, that's a really good place to start as well. I see there's a question saying from Delana, more familiar with Python, so it's a bit challenging to follow, but I was able to understand what and why you're doing. Awesome. I'm glad
Um,
for that. New developer, so thanks again. We'll need to rewatch this. Yeah, I appreciate that. I'm glad it was helpful. So I got a question. What kind of apps can we build for Zoom Rooms? So Zoom apps do work within the Zoom Rooms context. You can still absolutely use this app as well as an API integration for Zoom Rooms. And if talking more about our docs, if you can open up the reference for that, and you can see all the different running contexts for an app. And so there is the in meeting context, there's the in client context. Um, I think it depends on the Zoom Room client they're using where the interface is displayed, whether it's on the terminal or on like a connected screen. Um, Really, the Zoom Rooms app side of this uh, isn't my forte, so I need to ask a SME for like specifics on implementing this with Zoom Rooms. But it's definitely something that can be done. A bit of follow up on the developer forum as well. Um, awesome. Any other Zoom apps questions or Zoom developer questions? Um, there's a lot you can build with the universal build flow, the way that we created our app. So, uh, you know, in this example, we made a request to the Zoom API, and we also used it. Of course, we use that app for our Zoom app. So you could also use those credentials for a different client SDK um, and different apps that you want to create, as Dante's showing here.
yeah, I'm gonna log out. I'm gonna log into my other account. Give me 1 second.
Awesome. Yep, looks like we have another C++ and Python developer um, on the system side of stuff. Very cool. Glad you enjoyed it.
All right, guys. So I'm in my Zoom Marketplace account. Um, I'll go ahead and widen the screen a little bit so we can see more of the page. And while we still have some time, that'll be cool just to like look over the access, the Surface tab. And here's like where you see where you can surface Zoom apps. So I know we had a question about whether it's available in Zoom Rooms. Like in that scenario, you would want to enable it in Zoom Rooms. As you see, for this workshop, we enable it in meetings, so that was all that was required. You want to make sure you go through that flow and enable it. And the great thing about this app here is that you get to just enable and disable many different features. So this is a very simple app, but beyond that, there's more features that you can take advantage of. So there's like a guest mode, right? So if you ever like been on Instagram or any kind of like social media app and somebody sends you a link, and you're able to go to that site and scroll a little bit, and then it prompts you to like log in. Zoom SDK provides that same mechanism, right? So your app can always be accessible to users so they can learn about, the value you bring and how to use your app. And then you can always prompt them to authenticate, which would give you more access to their data. Um, but the great thing there is that whether they have authorized the app or haven't authorized, they always have access to your app within the Zoom client to open it up and get work done. Um, More things we have is collaboration mode. So like as we're looking right here, we see like I'm sharing my screen. But if you notice when I share my screen, I can't click it. You're only able to view it. The great thing about collaboration mode, it turns the whole screen sharing experience to an interactive experience. So you'll be able to walk through, click buttons, make actions, work collaboratively within the meeting and still continue afterwards. Um, and then also the Zoom Apps framework, right? So we have the Zoom Apps SDK, and then there's a Zoom Apps framework, which allows for you to open up dialogues within the Zoom team chat. So in that implementation, right in the flow of work, you're able to allow users to have access to your app and open up a dialogue of your Zoom app right there. So if they need to update a ticket, acknowledge anything, add a note, you also can provide that way. So the Zoom platform is open in so many ways for you guys to build out great use cases that leverages AI even in the platform.
Yep, absolutely. Good call out, Dante. And I think with that, we can probably wrap up. Um, but thank you everyone so much for joining and sticking through to the end. We really appreciate that. And happy coding.